After a long and eventful life, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, has died at the age of 99. He was, by some distance, the longest-serving royal consort in British history, a role he'd made his own. From the day of his marriage to the future Queen and throughout her long reign, he was at her side in good times and bad.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
The Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme for young people is just one of the achievements he will be remembered for, and for which he has received praise from political leaders.
Like the expert carriage driver that he was, he helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life.
In recent years, the Duke was rarely seen in public. He'd retired from public duties in 2017 after 70 years of service. Prince Philip was last seen as he returned home to Windsor on the 16th of March following a month-long stay in hospital. His loss, naturally, will be felt most keenly today by his widow, the Queen, whose reign has been sustained by his advice and presence. So, in this special edition of the papers, we'll be taking a look at the front pages and their coverage of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. Joining me for that are the royal commentator Peter Hunt and the former Fleet Street editor Yves Pollard. And the BBC's royal correspondent Daniela Ralph will be here too. Hello to you all. We're going to look at some of the front pages now. We're going to start with the Telegraph. Some wonderful images, I have to say, on the front of all of them. The picture editors going through their archives, picking out different highlights from the Duke's life. This, the Daily Telegraph. HRH, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, there in full regalia. Of course, he is the longest-serving consort in British history, and the Daily Mail has him by the side of the Queen. Queen's heartbreaking tribute to her husband of 73 years. Farewell, my beloved. Historic 144-page issue there in the Daily Mail. The Daily Star, her rock, we heard those words mentioned by the Queen. I think it was on the occasion of her Silver Jubilee during those celebrations. She mentioned him as her rock, her stay, and there he is doffing his bowler hat. I think that was at the one of his last public engagements before the Royal Marines. The Sun has a wraparound, interesting front cover there, and I need to put my glasses on to read what's beneath the masthead, and it says R.I.P. the People's Duke there. And there he is in black and white. We're all weeping with you, ma'am, front page of the Sun. Lots of coverage today of his playfulness, as well as being stern and the leader of the family. But of course, he had a playful side to him, and there's another wraparound front page from the Times, the Duke of Edinburgh, playing polo on a bicycle. And finally, The Guardian. Prince Philip, 1921 to 2021, in advanced years. There he is on the front page. We're going to go through quite a few of those now. I just want to get the initial thoughts of our guests. Yves, if I could turn to you. A historic day, obviously, and a man who was at the side of the Queen and helped make her reign the success that it is.
Absolutely. Quite a few of these front covers refer to the two words we've used all through today, duty and service. This was a man who gave up the career he really wanted to be in charge of his own vessel, to be a commander of a ship. Very, very early at 25, Her Majesty the Queen became Queen. And he'd hoped, I guess, that they would have another 10 years, perhaps, of not being in that position. And it's said that when he had to tell the Queen about the King's death, when they'd gone off to Kenya at treetops, the world had fallen in on his own plans and his own life. And he got on and he enriched this country in many ways, apart from supporting her so brilliantly. The Duke of Edinburgh's award schemes, we loved many of his gaffes. We thought that he was a man who was doing the very best he could to help the Queen, who had become 25 Queen. A double act was necessary, as Princess Anne said. They needed to both be in it together, and he supported her all the way. There are some interesting front pages, and there's some front pages that very much relate to the readers of their newspapers. It's quite interesting to watch.
Peter, you covered the royal family for quite a few years in this parish, as it were. What are your thoughts today?
Well, I think the key bit really is what has been captured in the papers, which is the loss for the Queen. It was very striking, wasn't it? In the public statement, the few words that they did issue, they talked about her deep sorrow, and they talked about how he was her beloved husband. And we all know people, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, where one of them dies and another the person is left behind, their sort of sense of loss in the latter years of their life. And he was crucial to her and crucial to her reign. And the people around her always said that when the going got tough, it was when his advice was particularly good and particularly helpful to her. And he sort of helped her, you know, she is a deeply conservative with a small c woman. He helped her navigate the changes in our society that they witnessed from their marriage in the 40s through to now. But also, just as crucially, he helped her navigate the tumultuous episodes that occurred during her reign and threatened her reign. The collapse of several of her marriages, very publicly, of her children's marriages in the 1980s, and the worst week of her reign so far, the week after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. And so he was there by her side. He now no longer is there by her side. And in the peculiar world in which she lives, having lost her mother, having lost her sister, she has now lost her husband.
Daniela here in the studio, having taken over some of the duties that Peter actually filled in covering this. I suppose for journalists sort of covering this kind of story, a huge story. What's it been like for you today?
Yeah, it's been an interesting day, I think, and a time of reflection, sort of personally, I suppose. I've been thinking a lot about the time, as I'm sure Peter has, that we, over the years, have seen them together on public engagements and observed how they are with one another. And it's been really interesting. You know, they were a couple of their class, of their generation. They weren't demonstrative with one another, and often on a public engagement they wouldn't even talk to one another, but he was just always there. He knew his place, just a few steps behind her. He was often sort of choreographing things behind the scenes, you know, pulling children out from the crowd to talk to her, guiding her a certain way or another. And it was very obvious when you observed them like that, just what a bond they had. They were so different in temperament, different in mood, different in the way they thought about things and approached life. But there was just a deep understanding, which of course you will get living the kind of life they have both lived in the public eye, in the spotlight after 73 years of marriage.
Sure, of course. Well, the Duke's children have been reflecting on their father's life in a BBC One documentary aired earlier tonight. Let's have a listen to the thoughts of Prince Charles and Princess Anne talking about growing up alongside their father.
Well, you know, he didn't suffer fools gladly, and so you had to. So if you said anything, you know, that was in any way ambiguous, he'd say, "Well, make up your mind," you know. So perhaps it made one choose your words carefully, if you know what I mean. He was very good at showing you how to do things and instruct you in various things.
As you grew older, there was a lot of talking to you, as you know, about things that he'd done, so you became aware of what else was going on and the things he'd been doing. But there was a huge amount of encouragement to do things, and got a lot of leeway in terms of, you know, pushing your own boundaries, which probably not given to many nowadays, I have to say.
Yeah, let's turn back to you, Eve, on this. I mean, obviously, you know, he was a great-grandfather, a father, and a sense, obviously, of loss from his children today, but also the fact that he helped mould them and shape them in ways that perhaps, you know, they're only now potentially appreciating now that he's gone.
I think that's right. I think as a nation, I think people have understood the Duke of Edinburgh's award did that for people, did that for young people, made them feel that they could accomplish things. And it was possible for any young person, any class, any place in Britain, and now, of course, all over the world, millions of children took this up. But of course, the royal, particularly the two older royal children, are now getting to be, 70s and 60s. They look back, and of course, they've got children and grandchildren of their own now, and they're looking at what and how he did influence them. And you have to remember that he's got this name as being a bit gruff and, saying what he wants to say, but he tried to help Princess Diana and wrote her lovely letters. And if you remember, she wrote to him saying, "Dear Pa," and being very thankful that he was trying to help her, although he said he didn't think he was very good as a marriage counselor. He spent more time probably with his children because he'd had such a very difficult early life himself, and his parents had split up when he was about 9, and he barely ever lived in a family home except for relatives after that. And so I think he always said, look, people talked to him about his life where he went to visit relatives across the other side of Europe on his own. He used to be sort of parked in different families for the holidays when he was not away at boarding school. And people say, well, nowadays, if that happened, children would be taken into care or they'd have counselling. And he just said, things happen, you just have to deal with them. But I think that experience meant he was really interested in his children's lives, and could have been bad, could have been good some days, but he was there for you.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, that interest in young people and trying to sort of build a sort of sense of resilience and inner strength as a young person, I mean, that seemed to inform his creation of the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme. I mean, I did the scheme myself, and I know that I found, I suppose, pockets of my own personality that I didn't know were there until they were tested, while I was camping out or trying to sort of, achieve the Gold Award. And I suppose that sense that he wanted to bring out the inner strength of younger people, that was something that he had to find because of his own difficult upbringing.
You stop showing off that you did the gold, Colin.
I've only mentioned it twice now.
Excellent. I spent 3 hours on another station where I had to keep confessing I didn't do it, even though my daughter did. I had interviewing ones. Anyway, I think it was very much forged in his childhood, really. I mean, it's very striking that, as Eve was saying, that he had a difficult childhood. There was a period when he was around the age of 10 where he didn't see any of his immediate relatives. Gordonston, that sort of school that he went to, the boarding school in a remote part of Scotland, was pretty pivotal, really, to his upbringing and to forming his character. I mean, they have a fondness of cold showers that I don't necessarily share. I mean, they believed in harm behind it, believed in confronting your fears and confronting the issues that troubled you, and that really did form his character and went on. And it was Kurt Hahn who asked the Prince Philip to found the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, as we now call it. And of course, Gordonston was where he then encouraged Charles to go, and Prince Charles didn't have such a good time. I was very struck by those 2 clips we just heard of the children. His children, they really sort of captured their characters, didn't they? I mean, Charles saying he didn't suffer fools. I mean, Charles and Prince Philip had a difficult relationship at times, and Prince Philip once described it as, Charles is a romantic, I'm a pragmatist, and because we see things differently, I'm seen as unfeeling. And then we had Anne saying he gave me leeway, and one can well imagine she was given leeway and she took it.
Yeah, I mean, let's turn to you, Daniela, here in the studio. Let's bring up a front page of the Mail as well, if we can, for our viewers. And, again, the couple there. Farewell, my beloved. We're living through a pretty terrible time with coronavirus. And I remember when the Queen came out and gave that address to the nation, probably about this time last year, I think it was. She said, we will all meet again. And there was a sense that the royal family was bringing us together as a nation in a difficult moment. But the success of the Queen in being able to achieve that, frankly, was built on the support that she was getting all the time over the last 70-odd years from Philip. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, they were devoted to one another. They had a clear connection. He knew his place. He knew what he needed to do to support her in her public life. And the thing that's also struck me, actually, over recent months reporting on the royal family is the fact that over the past year, the Queen and Prince Philip have been locked down together in this HMS bubble, as it's been described, at Windsor Castle. And it's probably the most amount of time they have spent alone, effectively, with one another during the course of their 73-year marriage. They haven't had their wider family around them. On Christmas Day, I was at Windsor. It was just the two of them there celebrating Christmas. There wasn't the usual big family gathering at Sandringham, and it's sort of pros and cons, I suppose. They have had this sort of intimacy and closeness together in lockdown in the past year, but they've also been without their wider family, and I think that will be a degree of sadness within the royal family that they haven't been able to perhaps spend as much time with the Duke of Edinburgh over the past year in what was his final year.
Sure. OK, Daniela, I know you've had a busy day and I know you've got still more work to do, even though it's a late hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Eve, I'm going to turn to you. We're going to bring up the front page of the Times as well. I mean, I love this. This is wonderful. Yeah. The Duke of Edinburgh there. He's playing polo on a bicycle. Now, he does have this reputation for being a bit stern and a bit gruff and not suffering fools gladly and all that. But, you know, there was a lighter side. Obviously, the Queen fell in love with this side of him as well. And this looks as if, from the woman next to him, which is not captured in this picture here, it's on the wraparound back side of it, as it were. She looks as if she's probably this is a picture from the sort of, I don't know, early 70s maybe, perhaps. But that sense that, you know, he was playful, he was dashing, he was funny. I mean, the Queen obviously found that very attractive.
Oh, I think everybody found that very attractive. I think what is lovely about that, and it's sort of almost my winner, although I like one or two of the other poster pictures, which the way we used to produce papers in the 80s, is some picture editor saw that picture and thought, one day, sadly, Prince Philip will die, and that's the picture that sums him up. And I hope it brings a little smile to some of the royals who will obviously be in deep mourning. I think that he was funny. I mean, I remember very clearly some time ago, he used to come to journalist charity events. You can imagine how charitable he felt towards journalists sometimes, but they used to support it. It's for journalists who are fallen on hard times. And I remember he said, "You're not as old as me yet," but he saw me holding a glass of wine. He said, "As you get older, best to drink beer. It's better for you." And so I thought, nice thing to say, really considerate, which I always think he has been. And of course, over the years, as all journalists have, you've met him at certain things. Anyway, I kept this to myself and didn't tell anybody. I thought it was a really nice bit of quiet information. And I met him about 2 years later at something. And of course, by this time, he told everybody about the beer. I mean, my little exclusive that I was going to pop out at some stage eventually went. And I said, "So you told everybody about the beer?" He said, "I'm trying to keep you lot alive." And I thought that was such a nice thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, as a former Fleet Street editor, Eve, what's the kind of picture you would have chosen? Would it have been this playful one, or would it have been one with him beside the Queen? Which one would you have picked for a front page?
You know, you like the Daily Mail, which is, they're looking at one another, gazing into one another's eyes, or there's also a wedding picture and all the rest of it, and then 144-page magazine inside, souvenir. And these were what I call poster front pages. These are the pages of newspapers in the old days people would keep. It was sort of historic, it was special. And it's quite nice that tradition goes on. And I rather like to think that somebody, I probably would never have found it, but the picture editor would have found that picture and produced that this morning and said, "This is the picture we should use." And he was right in many ways. But then you've got The Guardian. The Guardian does a picture of him very recently. He looks pretty lined. And there are lots of other stories on the front page. But that's totally right for The Guardian readers who have never been really devout monarchists, probably. Every paper has to tailor what they're doing on the front page, and an important front page today, because I think we've all been slightly more stirred and upset than we thought we would. Worried about the Queen, of course. So nice to see that Prince Charles went to see her today. But also, we've discovered we've lost more than we realized we had, possibly, because this service, this duty has come to the fore, and we've realized how much he had to possibly give up of things he wanted to do to be the great helper and make this great reign go on so long and be so fantastic.
Yeah, Peter, having covered the royal beat, as it were, for quite a while, I mean, that sense of duty and service, the fact that he had a very, very promising career in the Navy, was tipped potentially to go all the way to the top. The world was at his feet, and yet he chose to give all that up in the service, not just of the woman he loved, of the Queen, but of his country as well. All that has shone through a lot of the coverage and is frankly a big part of what the papers are reporting in the morning.
Yes, I mean, he struggled with it at times. Anyone who's watched The Crown will remember that from the 40s and the 50s. I mean, they had an idyllic period just after they got married, the late 40s into the early 50s, where he managed to do both. She was still a princess. He was a prince. He had a career within the military. They were posted to Malta. They had idyllic times there where there was just the two of them. They could go off and he started to play polo. They could have picnics. And then suddenly her father's health continued to deteriorate. And he realized even before her father had died, the king had died, that they would have to do more royal duties. And one of his relatives said at the time that, they put the bird back in the gilded cage, and that was the end for him. And he said in subsequent life, I didn't choose to be the sort of president of the Mint Advisory Committee. I mean, he would have much rather if he could have carried on with that military career, but he appreciated that he couldn't. And the other thing we can't lose sight of is that this was a very alpha male who then devoted much of his adult life to walking 2 paces behind his wife, the woman he loved and the woman he had married. And so there was a period of adjustment in the 50s for him, an adjustment that many times people joining the royal family have to. The old guard in the palace at that time were pretty wary of him. He wasn't part of the British aristocracy. They were quite sniffy about him. He found it hard, and his friends used to say at the time that every idea he had, they sort of squashed, and they sort of tried to put him in a corner and not let him sort of explore his ideas. But he managed to find and navigate a way through that enabled him to support his wife and also to support the institution of the monarchy. And that really is his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, either that sense that he was an outsider, and he always saw himself as an outsider. And while he was clearly the fulcrum of the family as well, particularly away from public duties, in Buckingham Palace, he did lead that family, no question about it. He was, as a result of potentially being an outsider, able to sort of see the difficulties that perhaps someone like Princess Diana felt when she joined the family, and that was revealed in those letters that were published after her death.
Absolutely. I mean, they were very warm and loving letters, weren't they? He was trying to do his best to repair whatever he could. And I think you're absolutely right that he looked at things in a very practical way as well. I mean, he was the man who, when they did move into Buckingham Palace, realized the kitchen was miles away, which is why every meal turned up cold. He was a modernizer in that he was the one who said we should televise the coronation. I remember, the coronation, tiny television set, and there it was. We were taken to someone's to watch it. And that was the beginning of television for me, really. It's a strange thing that he was the one who moved the royal family on gently, slowly over the last, 40, 50 years. And he actually realized that they had to let a little light into the monarchy. So that's where they made that film, The Royal Family, which has been tucked away and never shown again. And actually, when you see, there were just few bits of it on today and various broadcasts, and you realize it's actually charming. But nobody, ever thought that the Queen actually sat down and watched a TV program with a child or a corgi on her lap. But of course, that's how real life is lived. And we needed to see a bit of that. I think that he had a bluff side, the famous gaffes, which he worried about being a caricature. But then he often said quite funny things. I remember reading that one day he said, when you see a man opening the door of his car to his wife, it's either a new car or a new wife. I thought, perfect understanding of what's going on in the real world. He could make us laugh. And I think having that for the Queen, who had grown up to be quite shy, had grown up to be in a very cozy family of 4, where she was adored and looked after and understandably raised with the idea of Queen, she needed that as a sort of other side of her.
We're all of a certain generation, I think, and a lot of the images and the copy in the papers tomorrow morning. They're reflecting on a long life. But Peter, you mentioned the crown. Do you think, is it fair, do you think, that for a lot of young people, their understanding of who Prince Philip was, what his life was like, might come through that TV program and not necessarily through the newspapers?
I suspect that's the case, and I suspect that's the case with a lot of young people, even about Diana, Princess of Wales. It's certainly the case with my children, that their first real understanding of her introduction to the royal family and her treatment by the royal family and her experience within the royal family, their understanding of it has come from the crown. So I suspect that will be the case as well for Prince Philip, not least because, as we've been discussing, he sort of started to disappear from view over the last sort of decade or so. So he wasn't as significant a present in recent years as he was in past ones.
Yeah, I mean, Eve, a lot of the pictures do have him in full regalia. I mean, him having to give up his public duties and you know, a lot of I suppose the roles that he had with various sort of organizations, institutions, the military and so on. He had to give all that up. That must have been difficult. Obviously, he was in advanced years. But, I mean, that shows the level of commitment that he did have to this country, and a country that he, frankly, adopted many years ago.
Well, I mean, he used to call himself the refugee husband. I mean, and it was a secret that the Queen Mother, she, you know, became, wanted Princess Elizabeth to marry, you know, an aristocrat from Britain, you know, a duke or an earl. And although he was a prince and a prince of Greece and Denmark, and of course also slightly related to the Queen, long distant cousins, because they were both, of course, related to Queen Victoria, which if you come from the right side of the fence, all of you are related to Queen Victoria, sadly not me.
Me neither.
He had to take on a role that he knew he was being called the Hun behind his back at the beginning. He knew the courtiers weren't quite sure of him. They all knew that he had no money, so they were watching, I presume, to see if he was going to steal the silver. And then he opened up Buckingham Palace, he opened up the royal family, and of course he supported the Queen in the most wonderful way. So he turned it all on its head because people were very worried, and there are even letters saying, you know, I'm worried about this new man and princess's life, and when she marries him, will it be the right one, and all the rest of it. And understandably, she was the jewel in the crown. She was going to be the future queen. And he supported her all the time. Little ways, you would see them as both of Peter and the lady who was on before, sorry, I've forgotten her name now, said you watch them, yes, you watch them working together, and you knew that he was checking, and he would find, as you say, child, or he would take a bunch of flowers and make sure it was put in the pile that she was going to be given by the lady in waiting. He was very aware of normal and real people, and normal and real people, people who did, you know, for carriage riding with him, and people who were working on the Sandringham estates. They knew him as a friend, not just as a prince.
Okay. Peter, very briefly, you've got 20 seconds. The papers are all being incredibly generous, incredibly kind, and quite rightly. And they're the first draft of history, of course. How will history, do you think, Peter, sum him up?
I think they'll sum him up in terms of his incredible contribution to the Queen's personal life, the life of her family, and also to the institution, the monarchy. But I think the crucial thing we should focus on really is what he said when he was asked how did he think his epitaph would be, and he responded, I'm not really concerned, I'll be dead by then.
All right, we're going to leave it there. It's great to see you both. Wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you again. That's it from this special programme. My thanks to Eve Pollard and Peter Hunt, and from us all, good night.